In a storage drawer somewhere in the back rooms of a European museum, in the year 2003, there is a fragment of skull. It has been cataloged for decades under a disputed label. It has been examined, photographed, debated, and largely set aside. Nobody has run its DNA. Nobody has asked it the one question that would matter most. When researchers finally do, when the sample is extracted, processed, and returned after months of lab work, the result does not come back the way anyone expected. The mitochondrial haplogroup does not match, not the expected Egyptian profile, not the Near Eastern pattern that would have fit the geography. Something else entirely appears on the readout, something distributed across Anatolia, across the Levant, across the early farmers of ancient Europe, a signal that has almost no baseline presence in the core Nile Valley populations of the period. This is not a footnote discovery about an unknown individual. The fragment in that drawer belongs, according to some researchers, to one of the most famous women in the ancient world, a queen whose face has been staring at us from museum walls for over a century. A woman whose image became the defining portrait of Egyptian civilization, Nefertiti. The result should have matched. It didn't, and that is where this story begins to pull apart. Most people carry a very clear picture of Nefertiti in their minds, even if they cannot explain where it came from. The high cheekbones, the elongated neck, the painted limestone bust discovered at Amarna in 1912, now displayed in Berlin, now one of the most reproduced images of the ancient world. She feels familiar. She feels Egyptian. She feels exactly what the history books say she was. Great royal wife of Akhenaten, powerful figure of the 18th dynasty. Probably born around 1370 BCE, dead or disappeared from the record sometime around 1330 BCE. Her name, in the ancient Egyptian language, means something close to, "the beautiful one has come." Even her name sounded like an arrival, like something pulled naturally from the soil of the Nile Valley itself. The dominant scholarly model, the one that sat more or less unchallenged for most of the 20th century, placed Nefertiti firmly inside the Egyptian elite. Born of noble Theban lineage, raised inside the same civilization, she would help rule. Her ancestry, in this version of the story, was exactly what her title and her iconography suggested: Egyptian through and through. There was a competing theory, a minority view. A few scholars proposed she might have been Tadu Kipa, a princess from the Mitanni kingdom, a powerful state in what is now northern Syria and southeastern Turkey, sent to Egypt as part of the complex diplomatic marriage networks of the Bronze Age. But this hypothesis never gained widespread traction. There wasn't enough evidence to push it into the mainstream. The dominant model held, and why wouldn't it? Archaeology and inscription drove everything. The art said Egyptian, the title said Egyptian, the location said Egyptian. When you have no genetic data at all, what you can see fills the gap. What you can read becomes the record. And for generations, what scholars could see and read about Nefertiti confirmed the story they already had. But here is the problem. No one wanted to say out loud. Nobody had ever confirmed which body was hers. The bust survived. The inscription survived. The titles and the reliefs survived. But her mummy, the physical remains of the woman herself, had never been definitively identified. No confirmed tomb, no sealed sarcophagus with her name still attached to a skeleton. The most complete image of Nefertiti we possessed was a sculpture made of painted limestone, beautiful, precise, and genetically silent. Old model rested on art and assumption. And for a century, that felt like enough. 3 candidates had emerged for Nefertiti's physical remains by the late 20th century. Each one had some support. Each one had problems. The elder lady, a mummy found in a side chamber of tomb KV35 in the Valley of the Kings. The younger lady, found in the same tomb but in far worse condition. Her body badly damaged, her face partially destroyed, her bones suggesting deliberate violence inflicted sometime in antiquity. And an unnamed female mummy catalogued from tomb KV21, also in the Valley of the Kings. Scholars compared physical features. They estimated ages at death. They looked at what the inscription said about Nefertiti's likely lifespan and worked backward from the bones. There were serious arguments made for each candidate at various points, particularly for the younger lady, whose identification as Nefertiti was championed by British Egyptologist Joanne Fletcher in the early 2000s. But all of this was anatomy and inference, not genetics. Blind Spot was precise. Nobody had run comprehensive ancient DNA on the full candidate set with the explicit goal of resolving Nefertiti's ancestry and origins. Not just her identity, her origins, where she actually came from. The question the old model had answered with an assumption rather than evidence. Why not? Because for a long time it was genuinely not possible. This is the part that gets lost when people hear ancient DNA. They assume the technique works equally well everywhere. It doesn't. DNA is preserved by cold and dry conditions in a very specific way. The permafrost burials of Siberia, the peat bogs of northern Europe, the frozen high-altitude graves of the Andes. These environments act almost like biological freezers. DNA survives in them at extraordinary rates. Egypt is not cold. Egypt is hot. And in a hot, dry environment, DNA does not simply freeze in place, it degrades. The organic molecules that carry genetic information slowly break down over centuries, accelerated by heat and humidity. For ancient Egyptian mummies, the preservation of the body itself was often extraordinary. The preservation of readable DNA inside that body was far more fragile than it appeared. The 18th Dynasty mummies had been handled, transported, unwrapped, rewrapped, moved between tombs in antiquity, rediscovered by explorers, moved again, placed in museum collections, studied. Every point of contact introduced the risk of modern human DNA contaminating the ancient sample. And the younger lady, the candidate with the strongest case in Nefertiti's favor, had bones that were physically shattered, broken arm, crushed chest, deliberate destruction that made clean extraction more difficult still. A mitochondrial haplogroup is, in simple terms, a maternal lineage marker. It traces the direct female line, mother to daughter, across thousands of years, unchanged by recombination or drift. It places a person inside a global map of ancient human movement. And when the 2010 study led by Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass and a team of geneticists finally published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, it represented the first serious ancient DNA analysis of the 18th Dynasty royal mummies. The result for the younger lady confirmed her as the mother of Tutankhamun and a daughter of Amenhotep III. The genealogical chain was solid. She was inside the royal family. That much was established, and when the result finally came through, it raised a question nobody had prepared an answer for. Here is what the data showed. The younger lady carried haplogroup K. Haplogroup K is a well-documented mitochondrial lineage. It appears throughout ancient population genetic studies. It is found in elevated frequencies in ancient Anatolian farmers, the early agricultural populations of what is now Turkey. It shows up in the ancient Levant. It appears in early Neolithic European populations. It is, by the time of the 18th Dynasty, distributed across a wide corridor stretching from southeastern Europe through the Near East and into Central Asia. What it is not is a haplogroup concentrated in core Nile Valley Egyptian populations of the New Kingdom period. She was supposed to be Egyptian. Her DNA says something else got there first. Now, and this matters, there is an important distinction to hold in mind here. The identification of the younger lady as Nefertiti specifically is still debated. Hawass himself, who led the genetic study, has expressed skepticism about Fletcher's identification. The naming question is genuinely open. The younger lady may or may not be Nefertiti. But here is what is not in question. The haplogroup result is real. The lineage exists. A woman in the direct royal bloodline of the 18th Dynasty, carrying a haplogroup not characteristic of core Nile Valley ancestry, is not a minor footnote. And if the identification holds, the implications reach directly to the most famous queen in Egyptian history. The old model said, Egyptian elite lineage, confirmed and design lineage, confirmed by art and title. The genetic data, where it exists, says the ancestry was more complicated than that. That rules out things. specific things. It rules out the simple version of the Theban noble family origin. It significantly weakens the assumption, never tested but long held, that the 18th dynasty royal house drew its maternal lines from within the traditional Egyptian population. It raises the question of how much foreign origin ancestry had entered the family, and whether that ancestry was acknowledged, concealed, or simply never scrutinized because nobody had the tools to look. And then the Mitanni connection, the minority theory, the one that was set aside decades ago, quietly comes back into view. The Mitanni kingdom occupied exactly the corridor where haplogroup K has deep ancient roots: northern Mesopotamia, southeastern Anatolia, the precise geography where this maternal lineage was common in antiquity. The hypothesis that Nefertiti may have been a foreign-born princess sent to Egypt through the Bronze Age diplomatic marriage system, which was extensive and well-documented, is no longer genetically contradicted. I want to be careful here. The DNA does not prove she was Mitanni. One haplogroup traces only the maternal line. It says nothing definitive about a person's full ancestry, their paternal lineage, their cultural identity, or their self-understanding. Nefertiti may have grown up in Egypt, even if her maternal ancestry pointed elsewhere. People are more than their genomes. But here is what the data did. It reopened a door the old model had closed without ever checking whether it should be. This is where the story stops being about one woman and starts being about an entire dynasty's hidden ancestry. Nefertiti's husband is perhaps the most disruptive pharaoh in Egyptian history. Akhenaten, born Amenhotep IV, abandoned Egypt's ancient polytheistic religion and replaced it with monotheistic worship of the Aten, the sun disk. He moved the capital from Thebes to a newly constructed city, Amarna, built in the desert on land that had no previous sacred association. He changed the art style radically. He changed his own name. He attempted, in a single reign, to rewrite everything his civilization considered sacred. It failed. After his death, the old religion returned. His monuments were smashed. His city was abandoned. His successors tried to erase him from the record. Now, sit with this. Tutankhamun, son of the younger lady, raised in the court of a pharaoh who tried to demolish Egyptian religious tradition. It carries, on his paternal line, haplogroup R1b, a lineage that in the ancient period appears most commonly in Western Europe and the ancient Near East, rare in the modern Egyptian population. Unusual enough that when the Hawass team published their results, this finding generated its own wave of scrutiny and debate. Two haplogroups, two lineages, both pointing in different directions toward populations not centered in the Nile Valley. A royal family that broke with Egyptian tradition more completely than any other dynasty in the ancient world, sitting beside genetic signals that complicate the idea of a purely Egyptian bloodline. That convergence is not proof of anything singular, but it is a research question that ancient DNA has made newly urgent. The cultural rupture and the genetic discontinuity sit in the same historical moment, and that is hard to dismiss. And the Amarna royal family is not the only anomaly. In 2017, a study published in Nature Communications by Verena Schooneman and colleagues analyzed ancient DNA from mummies recovered from Abusir el Melek, a site in Middle Egypt spanning roughly 1400 BCE to 400 CE. The results were striking. Those ancient Egyptians showed greater genetic affinity to ancient Near Eastern and Anatolian populations than to sub-Saharan African populations. They clustered more closely with ancient Levantine and Anatolian samples than with modern Egyptians, who carry a sub-Saharan African genetic component that increased after the ancient period, likely through trade, migration, and contact during and after the Roman period. The picture this builds is not simple. Egypt was not genetically static. The Nile Valley sat at the crossroads of the ancient world, migration routes running north to south from sub-Saharan Africa, east to west from the Levant and Arabia, across the sea from Anatolia and the Aegean. The population that inhabited Egypt across different centuries and different social strata was not a uniform block. The ancient elite of the New Kingdom, the class from which Nefertiti emerged, or into which she married, may have carried ancestry profiles shaped by exactly this kind of movement. This does not mean the standard story of Egyptian civilization is wrong. Egyptian culture, architecture, religion, language, and identity were profoundly and distinctively Egyptian. But ancestry and identity are not the same thing. A person can be culturally Egyptian, politically Egyptian, religiously Egyptian, and still carry a maternal haplogroup that traces back to an Anatolian great-grandmother. The history books told us who Nefertiti was. The bones, cautiously, partially, imperfectly, are beginning to complicate that story. The caveats remain real. The younger lady identification is contested. Ancient Egyptian DNA is genuinely difficult to work with. Contamination is a persistent risk in any mummy study, and the Hawass results were scrutinized heavily for exactly this reason. One mtDNA haplogroup cannot carry the full weight of a biographical claim. The field acknowledges this. But here is what cannot be set aside. The assumption that nobody needed to check was never justified. The model held because the question was never asked with the right tools. And now that it has been asked, even partially, the answer is more complicated than anyone assumed. Nefertiti's tomb has never been found. In 2015, British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves proposed, based on analysis of laser scan data from the walls of KV-62, Tutankhamun's tomb, that there may be hidden chambers sealed behind decorated plaster, possibly Nefertiti's burial, possibly something else entirely. Ground-penetrating radar surveys produced contradictory results. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities investigated. The question remains unresolved. Her confirmed remains have never been identified. Her confirmed resting place has never been located. The face in Berlin, the bust, the painted eyes, the tilted chin, is still the most complete record of her physical appearance that survives. And that record is ART, created by a sculptor, commissioned by a court, expressing an idealized image of royalty. It tells us nothing about her haplogroup. It tells us nothing about where she was born. The erasure came after Akhenaten's death. Temples were reconsecrated, monuments were defaced, images of Nefertiti were chiseled away from walls across Egypt. Her name was removed from official records wherever her successors could reach it. She ruled one of the most powerful civilizations in the ancient world, alongside a pharaoh who tried to remake that civilization entirely, and then history tried to unmake her. She survived as a face, only a face. 3,300 years later, a fragment of skull sits in a storage drawer. It has been there for decades. It carries, locked inside degraded bone, a maternal lineage that does not match the story told about her, a genome that points toward corridors and populations the history books never connected to her name. We have had her face for a century. We have studied it, reproduced it, put it on posters and book covers and museum walls. We have built an entire mythology of ancient beauty around a sculpture. We may never fully have her story, and the bone that came closest to telling it still hasn't been asked the right question with the right tools. Not yet.